The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the third day of this 7-day sesshin, the first sesshin here in January 2023 at Mountain Gate in northern New Mexico. And I'd like to continue with a theme that began on day one, and that is about perception and the need to go beyond our usual way of perceiving things, our habitual way of seeing things, because it is habitual. When light hits the retina, the back of our eyes, and travels through the optical nerve to the brain, it is simply a pattern of light. It is the brain that makes something of it. And then we go further in analyzing, in judging, in assuming, and out of this, our entire background comes forth, our conditioning, our culture, everything else. And through that lens, we, quote, see, close quote, something. The same goes for hearing, for example. Vibrations enter the inner ear. Well, not exactly the inner ear. They bump against the tympanum, and that causes some things to happen inside. And again, those nerve impulses go to our brain and we interpret them. This is responsible for a lot of misperception. There was the brother of someone who used to sit with us for some time, and actually was very instrumental in building the Zendo. He taught us how to build with adobe bricks. I don't know whatever has happened to him. Last I knew, he had gone to live in Africa, and I have not heard from him since. And that's been probably 15 years, 20 years. At any rate, his brother was a pilot in the Air Force and in training to be a fighter pilot. And the last apparent test that he was to have was to identify very rapidly whether the image of a plane that was anywhere near him was friend or foe. And he failed the test. I don't know what happened to him after that, but I assume that he did not become a fighter pilot. We're all vulnerable to these misperceptions. Let's start with that. Perception creates our world, and perception is impacted by our conditioning, by how we grew up, what the environment was, how we were treated, what kinds of things happened to us, and what conclusions we drew about ourselves as a result of those things happening. It creates a world of our own. And we're all going around with these individual worlds of our own, created by our own experiences and our conclusions drawn by them as a result of our perceptions. And the big question is, what is reality? You've heard the story in the past of when I was in grade school in Canada. And back then, of course, we were fairly regimented. We didn't think of it as that, but that's what, there were rules, there were forms that we had to fit into, lining up with our grade to go into school in the morning, standing at our desks and doing calisthenics, and singing. Back then it was God Save the King, because it was King George that was the king, Queen Elizabeth's father. And there were other things. And I remember, because we were all sitting in rows back then, and we were to be silent. We were to keep our hands clasped on a desk, on our desktop, if we were not actively using them. And it was all relatively quiet classroom. Kids in those days were not, well, there was more space around us. There was more space in people's lives in general, where the world was slower then. And so there wasn't the kind of thing that is happening now. There was just another mass shooting in California, a second one in quick succession to the ballroom shooting. And this has become a way of life for us. But it wasn't like that back then. People were more quiet inwardly. And yes, there was trauma. In fact, there was a little boy in my class whose arm had clearly been broken and not properly set. And so in the calisthenics, he could not raise his arms the way we were all supposed to do in one part of the calisthenics. It was kind of sad, because one had the sense that he was either extremely poor and his family could not afford to take him to a hospital when his arm got broken, or he was being abused. There was also a little girl who was sitting in the line in the file of desks adjacent to me, and she had some kind of skin condition that was probably psoriasis. She was very shy, little girl, was not, did not engage in the rest of us particularly. And my heart went out to her because she was clearly unhappy. Clearly something was going on that was not very positive for her. I suspect now, looking back at it, that she was being abused, but at any rate, it was showing up in this scaly business that was on her arm. So in a moment of wishing to communicate to support her, I reached over and gently touched her arm, like to say, you have a friend, you have somebody that cares. But she interpreted that very differently and immediately cried out to the teacher that I was trying to hurt her. This is an example of misperception, and we go through life misperceiving. So, like Flora Courtois, who, after seeing many different events in her, by then, teenage life, and collecting aphorisms that seemed to fit whatever the event was, and realizing that as soon as the event was gone, the aphorism no longer applied, began wondering if there wasn't an underlying truth that was always true. And there is. So we sit here in the Zendo searching for that truth by opening up and becoming aware of our sensations in our body. And any, as my good friend Chisan would have said, stuck places or caught places within there. Any sense of resistance to feeling, any sense of blocking. And through this significant presence to whatever the sensations are, we can become little by little more and more free of being caught in our ideas, in our histories, in our life. And I'd like to share with you now some more of the writing of Jacques Luceron, who also recognized that. As you know his story, because he's been shared many, many times, in these taste shows. He was French. He was born before the Second World War. And when he was 8 years old, he was visiting his grandparents' house, and out in the backyard, which was called the garden, and realized with great grief that he was not going to be able to see the garden anymore. He had some form of premonition of what was coming up. And about 3 weeks later, as the kids were rushing out to recess in his classroom, somebody in their enthusiasm pushed, and he went into the corner of the teacher's desk with his eyeglasses in an era before they had mandated glasses that would not shatter. And his shattered, and that was the end of his eyesight. But he recognized that that was not the end of his seeing. He no longer saw with his eyes, but it opened up a vast and amazing world for him. And he speaks of it in a book called Against the Pollution of the Eye, meaning me, myself, and I, not EYE, and tells something of how it unfolded for him in life, and his own sense of the challenges that actual eyesight holds for seeing people, for sighted people. We tend to become dependent upon it. It becomes, for most people, the first source of input, the major source of input into the so-called outside world. But it is not the only perception tool that we have. And when we're no longer able to depend on it, other options are more obvious. So let me share something, a few words from him, from a chapter called Blindness, a New Way of Seeing of the World. So he talks about sight, and he said, it is a very precious tool, and the blind who are deprived of it suffer heavily. Yet it is only a tool, and therefore can be replaced. One of the greatest riches at our disposal is that there are so many possibilities of sensual perception that there is no unique or irreplaceable tool. Each sense can take the place of another if it is used in its totality. And that was briefly mentioned at the beginning of this talk, that we don't use these tools in their totality. We have a sense impression, the light hitting our retina, going through the optic nerve into our brain, and a conclusion is drawn about the picture that the brain conjures up in result, and that picture is dependent on our conditioning, on our experiences, and may or may not be accurate, and it's also quite limited. We see a person, they may remind us of somebody, and so the emotion comes up with regard to whoever it is that they remind us of. That person is not that other person that we are reminded of, and may be very different. But we've immediately categorized them, put them in a slot. And then from then on, when we see somebody that looks like that, has the hairstyle or the clothing or whatever, plunk right into that category box without any questioning about it. And so we lock ourselves into a very narrow way of perceiving. When we are small children, we're not like that. I remember when my older son was born, and he began to walk rather early. In fact, he fell out of his crib when he was 5 months old, trying to climb out. This is a bit young for that kind of behavior, but nonetheless, he was active. And having my own experience with raising children, being a teenager in the last case, and 11, 12 years old in the earlier case, with the birth of my sisters, I was a firsthand observer of how my mother trained her kids. And from her perspective, every infant born is quote a blank slate, and you have to sort of inculcate the appropriate behaviors into that blank slate. You have to make them be who you think they should be. That's quite far from the truth, but nonetheless, that was my experience. And so I am going out for a walk with my little toddler, and he is into exploring. He's fascinated by everything. And I'm trying to make him come to me by saying come, just like I do with Boo, the dog. And it began to get a little ridiculous, actually. He had his own way of exploring the universe, and I'm glad I wasn't more forceful in preventing him from doing it that way. He still remains immensely curious about everything, and that's quite wonderful. He's had a very rich and interesting life. If we allow our children to explore their universe without doing anything more than making sure that they don't run out in traffic, for example, or stick their hands into the fire, which unfortunately he did a few times. He was too short to see the top of the stove, and he would reach his hand up, and the flame would be going, and of course he would burn himself, not seriously, thankfully, but and he did have some adventures, climbing up onto the trash can in the kitchen in Burma, and the lid flipped and he went down. I think it was his first concussion of many, onto the concrete floor. Another time when we were living in Burma, we had been visiting friends, and I looked around as we were about to go, and I said, "Where's Randy?" And the consulate driver, pointed up to the top of the roof, and he was running along the ridge. He was about 3 or 4 years old at the time. So within limits, we try to keep them safe, but we can go a long way to inhibiting our children. That said, we knew another couple of kids that were stair steps from my kids when we were living in Thailand, whose parents were dead set against any form of inhibition at all with their kids. And their kids turned out to be quite little monsters, because they would jump into people's laps and wave their hands in front of their eyes when the adults were trying to talk to their parents, and various things like this. There has to be a certain middle way about things. Anyway, let me go to Jacques and comment, read from this chapter in Against the Pollution of the Eye. So it is a very precious tool, this sight, and the blind who are deprived of it suffer a heavy loss. Yet it is only a tool, and therefore can be replaced. One of the greatest riches at our disposal is that there exists so many possibilities of sensual perception, that there is no unique or irreplaceable tool. Each sense can take the place of another if it is used in its totality. And I commented about how we normally don't use any of our senses in totality. And in Zen practice, we're called upon to do so. But now we are faced with a great difficulty, for seeing is a superficial sense. It is often said that seeing brings us closer to things. Seeing certainly permits orientation, the possibility of finding our way in space. but with what part of an object does it acquaint us? It establishes a relationship with the surface of things, the superficiality of things, not the energy of things, not the sense that the thing emits. So we're very limited in what we can experience, not what we can experience, but what we do experience, because we see things, hear things, feel things superficially. So this applies to our life. And when Jacques was deprived of his sight, he opened to a whole new world. And let me share a little bit about that. What simply has to be understood is that seeing is not the work of the eyes alone. The ability to see must exist before its physical instrument. The ability to see, the willingness to see. And we so often build a framework around ourselves such that we see with limited extent, because that framework is built of assumptions, of what we're going to see, what we're going to do, and that limits that perception, skews it, and makes it, in many cases, completely unreliable. There are so many stories about this. There was a movie, a Japanese movie called Rashomon. A mon is a gate, so I think it's Rashomon. Anyway, and the whole story, is black and white, is that there are these men, presumably homeless, who are sitting around a little fire that they have made as they take apart this gate, this massive gate. Now, gates in Japan, that kind of gate is not what we would expect in the United States as a garden gate, for example. At the entrance to temples, there is a sanmon, as it's called at Sogenji. It's san mean the character for three, a triple gate, and it is usually in three segments. And it has an upstairs. It has two little huts, I guess you would call them, on framing the opening that is the gate, which is quite big. And within those little huts are a stairway that goes up to a second floor that spans the gate, and so you walk under that when you walk through the gate. It is made of wood, and it's a classic structure typical of Chinese temples and Japanese Zen temples as well. And so they're deconstructing this gate to provide themselves with some heat in this winter, and the winters in Japan are quite cold and damp. And as they're doing that, they're talking. One man begins to relate something that he saw. It happened to be a murder, actually, out in the forest. And you see in the movie, you see his version of this situation, where a man is leading presumably his wife, who's sitting on the horse. He's leading the horse through the forest, and I can't remember anymore what happened, but something happened, and so he tells his story, describes the situation, and another man in the group, there's like 4 men, I think, says, "No, that's not what happened. I was hiding in the bushes because I didn't want to be seen. And this is what I saw. And it was a very different version of the incident. And then a third man said, actually, I was over on this other side, and this is what I saw. And then the fourth man, also the same, if I'm remembering the movie right. But the point is that every single one of them had a very, very different perception of what happened, of the same simple incident, who murdered who, what the story was. And police are very familiar with this phenomenon because when accidents happen, uh, one person will be on one street corner and somebody will be on another street corner, and maybe people are on each of the corners of an intersection, and a car runs a red light and impacts another car, and the accident happens. And so they're interviewing each one of these people, and one says, this guy ran the red light and hit that car. And the next person said, actually, the car that ran the red light was coming from the left and hit the car that was perpendicular, and so on and so forth. And it's a well-known phenomenon. It's also impacted by the fact that when we see things like that, impactful things like that, we see and sort of recognize them at some level with our right brain, which is not the side of the brain that ordinarily speaks in words. Language is generally considered to be, although there's some possibility, there's some crossover, for a left brain attribute. And so when you have to start talking about it, unless you can visualize the picture, it's often mixed up when you try to put it into words, even if you can visualize the picture. Once you try to put it into words, it's not the reality anymore. And it gets skewed by your misperceptions, including things like that car that ran the red light was the same car that my uncle had when he was sexually abusing me, or something like that. And so there's already a prejudice against that car, even though it might have been the car that was hit, not the car that did the hitting. So that leaves us with, now what? Well, the what is to explore within ourselves, to tune into our sensations in our body, because that's a doorway into reality. We will have certain sensations that are positive, certain sensations that are neutral, certain sensations that are negative. It doesn't matter what the sensations are. The main point is to tune into them, pay attention to them, to allow an understanding of what they represent to arise, not to apply an understanding of the feeling, but to open to the possibility that it may express what its background is, what it really means. And this particularly applies to difficult feelings. In fact, if we've had painful experiences, if we have had trauma, if we have been abused, if we have had less than stellar upbringings, if we've had incidents in school, which are so prevalent, particularly these days, it colors our perceptions, and it makes us not want to feel the feelings that came up when those things were happening. And here I have to say that if there is actually trauma in your life, and many people shut it down to the point where they don't even realize there was, But if you get to a point in your Zen practice where it is difficult, where fear begins to come up, and saying that, I'll say a little bit more about fear in a minute, then it's worth getting in touch with a therapist that's trained in working with people who've been traumatized. Particularly these days, there are many, many people. Trauma is now in the forefront of psychological view. It's beginning to be realized that many, many, many people have experienced trauma that has really impacted their lives in negative ways. And there are more and more means to free ourselves from the tyranny of that trauma. And it's usually not talk therapy. It may be a combination of talk therapy, but it always involves some therapeutic work that involves sensations, because that's where it's stored. Bessel van der Kolk, the Dutch immigrant who has spent his whole, thus far, working life exploring the field of trauma and working to bring into the mainstream effective therapies that can help people who have been traumatized, particularly since so many people are traumatized these days with people coming back from war. And he's recently written a book, which apparently has been a bestseller for quite a while now, called "The Body." Is it "The Body Keeps the Score" or "The Body Knows the Score"? I can't remember which the title is. But if you have any sense of it, that you might have a history, then it's worth reading. It may be a difficult read for you, but it's worth reading. But if you haven't had a history of trauma, which is rather rare these days, by the way, and you find yourself bumping into some sensation that doesn't feel very good, and you initially automatically usually shut it down, work on trying to stay present with it, because it will tell you something. It will unlock its tenacity on your mood, on your life. And as you begin to become more aware of its subtleties, you will also become more free of its tyranny. This is really, really important work, because it is these kinds of things that stand in our way of accurate perception, of truly seeing with far more than our eyes, as Jacques Lassalle learned how to do. There's a little bit more he speaks of with regard to that, and I'd like to share some of it with you. He speaks of light. He says, "All is light in this blindness, and what is more, this manifest luminosity contains a magnificent lesson. Since my childhood, I have been impressed with the phenomenon of surprising clarity." Who would have guessed? "The light I saw changed with my inner condition. Partly it depended on my physical condition, for instance, fatigue, restlessness, tension, or relaxation. Such changes, however, were relatively rare. The true changes depended on the state of my soul. When I was sad, when I was afraid, all shades became dark and all forms indistinguished. When I was joyous and attentive, all pictures became light. Anger, remorse, plunged everything into darkness. magnanimous resolution, a courageous decision radiated a beam of light. By and by, I learned to understand that love meant seeing and that hate was night. I had the same experience with space. When I became blind, I found out that an inner space existed. This space also changed its dimensions in accordance with the condition of my soul. Sadness, hate, or fear not only darkened my universe, but also made it small. The number of objects I could encompass within myself with one glance decreased. In the finest sense of the word, I knocked against everything. Objects and beings became obstacles within myself. Outwardly, I could not avoid running against doors and furniture. I was punished very thoroughly and very quickly. Conversely, however, courage, attention, joy had the immediate effect of opening up and illuminating space. Soon everything existed in me abundantly. A great many objects, pictures, beings. I saw magnificent landscapes before me. I knew that this landscape could be expanded indefinitely. In order to achieve this, my joy had merely to become even greater. At the same time, my physical adroitness increased. I found my way and moved with assurance. In short, there were two possibilities: to reject the world, and that meant darkness, reverses, or to accept it, and that meant light and strength. I hope you can get a sense of what I'm trying to point out here, that when we allow ourselves to go beyond our assumptions about everything and simply tune in to the physical experience of the moment as it appears to us, it is very different. And that is a very important thing to understand with regard to Zen practice. That when we allow ourselves to open to the whole picture, essentially through wordless attention, awareness beyond the intellect, the whole world opens up. And our way moving through it, experiencing it, is so much more free. And at base, the deeper we go within this, the more free we are. And that is what Zen practice really is about. It's about opening us to the freedom that is innate in us, so that our compassion, the wisdom that lives within every being, is able to function fully. So on this third day of Sesshin, work on tuning in more subtly to your body with an openness to possibility that it might inform you in very valuable ways. And then keep going. Don't just do it on the cushion. Do it as you walk around, as you do things in your life. And it will be very different for you. Keep it going deeper. Keep it going deeper. It makes an enormous difference. And not only in your own life, but in the life of countless beings, because we are all influenced by each other in subtle ways. And the energy of each one of us expands exponentially into influencing all other beings. And when we can be let go, more free, that sense of freedom, of joy, of openness radiates out and infuses others and influences others. It makes a big difference. There are many examples of this that I won't go into at this time, but you've heard some of them already in previous teishos. So I thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.